The Myrtles Plantation up here in St. Francisville is one of those places where history and ghost stories got together, had way too much whiskey, and decided to raise a whole litter of myths and legends. Our story starts way back in 1796, when this part of Louisiana was still called Spanish West Florida. A man named David Bradford came riding south with trouble nipping at his heels. He had been mixed up in that whiskey rebellion up in Pennsylvania.
Look, when Britain taxed our tea, we got frisky. Imagine what's gonna happen when you try to tax our whiskey.
And needed a place where the law couldn't quite reach him. He found it on a rise above Bayou Sarah, in the deep hush of the Louisiana wilderness. And there, he built himself a home. He called it Laurel Grove, a fine, peaceful name for a man who had seen his share of chaos. By 1817, the Bradford family had settled in, and love was in bloom. David's daughter, Matilda, married a young lawyer named Clark Woodruff, a man of ambition and sharp edges. Together, they carried on the family's dreams, filling those old rooms with warmth and laughter. But Louisiana can be as cruel as she is beautiful, and by 1823, yellow fever came crawling up the river. It took Sarah Matilda first, then her two children, James and Cornelia. The disease was merciless, leaving Clark Woodruff a widower and the house echoing with silence where they had once been joy. By 1834, Woodruff had had enough of sorrow. He sold the place to Woodruff and Stirling, a wealthy planter with an eye for grandeur. Ruffin looked around at the blooming crepe myrtles that framed the property and gave it a new name, the Myrtles. Under his hand, the house nearly doubled in size. Its halls dressed in fine Rococo furnishings, its reflection of Southern wealth and ambition gleaming as bright as its gilded mirrors. In 1852, Ruffin's daughter, Sarah, married William Winter, weaving another family into the fabric of the estate. But the Myrtles, they have always known tragedy like a familiar guest. In 1871, William Winter met a violent and mysterious end right there on the front porch. Some say he was shot by a stranger and died trying to climb the stairs, his blood still marking the wood long after the story became legend. Sarah Winters carried on until her death in 1878, passing far from home in St. Louis, Missouri, but she was brought back to St. Francisville to rest. After that, the property shifted hands like a story passed from one generation to the next. In 1886, it went to R&D Brooks, and a few years later to Harrison Milton Williams, who kept it steady through the turn of the century. When Harrison died in 1909, his family held on to the old house until Fannie Williams passed in 1935, closing one long chapter in the Myrtles' life. By the 1950s, time and weather had worn the place, but then came Marjorie Munson, a woman with an eye for history and a will to restore. She breathed life back into the house, sanding down the scars of the past without erasing them. The work continued in 1976, when Arlen Deese and a partner bought the estate, and then again in the 1980s when James and Frances Myers turned it into a bed and breakfast. That was when the stories, the ones about ghosts and mysteries, began to take on a life of their own. Frances Myers even wrote a book about it in 1992, The Myrtles Plantation, the true story of America's most haunted house. And by then, people were coming from all over to see the place for themselves. That same year, the Moss family made it their home. And Mrs. Moss, she snapped a photograph that would become world famous, the one showing what folks swear is Chloe, the green-turbaned ghost said to haunt the halls. Whether you believe it or not, that picture helped cement the Myrtles place in American folklore. Through the 2000s, the plantation grew beyond its haunted reputation, adding a restaurant, guest cottages, gardens, and guided tours that told both the history and the mystery. And now, here in the 2020s, the Myrtle stands as a living place of Louisiana's past. 20 guest rooms, a coffee shop, candlelit dinners, and the whispers of centuries in every creak of the floorboards. It's a place where the past doesn't just linger, it looks you straight in the eye. And if you listen close enough, it might even tell you its story. The Myrtles at night is when the air turns heavy, the oaks whisper, and the old house seems to wake up. The nighttime mystery tour isn't just about ghosts. It's about the stories that still hang in the air like perfume. By candlelight, you'll walk the same halls where love, tragedy, and legend took root. You may hear a step on the stairs, catch a glimpse in the mirror, or just feel the quiet chill that says you're not alone. When you step back out beneath the St. Francisville stars, you'll understand why folks say the Myrtles doesn't just hold history, it remembers it. The first room you enter on the ghost tour is the foyer. In the old southern plantations, the foyer was more than just a hallway. It was a first impression wrapped in gold leaf and candlelight. Folks called it the heart of the house, where the breeze drifted through from the porch to back gallery, carrying the scent of magnolia and supper on the air. Back then, it wasn't just for cooling off, it was for showing off. A big gilt mirror, a marble-topped table, maybe a chandelier catching the light just so, all there to tell your visitors you've arrived somewhere worth arriving to. Guests were greeted there with calling cards and soft smiles before being led into the parlor, while portraits on the wall seemed to nod in approval. It was the house's handshake, warm, elegant, and just a little proud, the kind of welcome only the Old South could pull off. Now, let's talk about Chloe, the ghost who's been hanging around the Myrtles Plantation longer than most folks have been alive. Her story is the one everybody knows, the one that'll make you look twice at every shadow in this old house. They say Chloe was an enslaved woman who worked for Judge Clark Woodruff and his family back in the early 1800s. Smart as a whip, curious by nature, she had a habit of listening at doors she shouldn't have. One day, she got caught with her ear to the wrong keyhole, and the judge, wanting to make an example, had it cut clean off. And from that day forward, she kept it covered with a green turban, something that became her mark, both in life and after. A while later, when the judge's little girl had a birthday coming up, Chloe decided to bake a cake. Folks say she crushed up a few oleander leaves, not to kill anybody, mind you, just to make them sick enough that she could come in, nurse them back to health, and earn her way back into the family's favor. But Lord, that plan went sideways fast. Mrs. Woodruff and two of the children ate the cake, and by sundown, they were dead. The rest of the enslaved people knew they'd be hell to pay. And to save themselves, they dragged Chloe out beneath the cypress tree, hanged her, and tossed her body into the Mississippi River. Ever since that day, people swear she never truly left. They've seen her gliding through the halls, standing in doorways, or watching from the upstairs balcony. Always, always in that green turban. So now, let's set the record straight. Chloe wasn't her name. That's the one her master gave her when he bought her. Just handed it to her like a collar and expected her to wear it. See, back then, an enslaved woman didn't get to keep the name her mama whispered when she was born. The papers didn't care what she called herself. Once she was bought, the man signing the bill of sale decided what she'd be called from then on. Something soft on his tongue, easy to shout across a kitchen, or a cotton field. So when people talk about Chloe walking the halls of the Myrtles, what they're really remembering is a woman whose true name was lost the moment the ink dried. She might have been Arisatu or Mariama, names that carried the rhythm of the Senegal River, names that meant something once. But to Woodruff, she was Chloe. That's the name he gave her, and that's the name history's kept. And maybe that's why her story lingers. Not just because folks claim to see her shadow in the glass, but because somewhere in all that gold leaf and ghost light, there's a woman still waiting to be called by her real name. So what about Chloe's trademark green turban? Well, headscarves and turbans were not only common, but legally and culturally significant for black women in Louisiana, especially in and around New Orleans during the late 18th and early 19th centuries. Let's start with the law. In 1786, under Spanish colonial rule, Governor Esteban Rodriguez Miro issued what was called the Tian Law. It required all women of African descent, both enslaved and free, to cover their hair in public with a tian, or head wrap. The law was meant to enforce racial boundaries and discourage free black women from wearing elaborate hairstyles, jewelry, or headpieces that the white authorities felt blurred class and racial lines. But as often happens in New Orleans, what was meant as repression turned into fashion and pride. Women turned their required head wraps into bold, creative statements, bright silks, intricate folds, vivid patterns. It became an art form, not a mark of shame. Portraits from the time show women wearing gorgeously wrapped tianas, often with gold jewelry and lace dresses. By the early 1800s, the very time the Myrtles Plantation was active under Judge Woodruff, headscarves were just part of the daily life of black women across Louisiana, enslaved and free alike. On rural plantations, women tied them up for practical reasons, to keep hair out of food, fire, or sweat while cooking, washing, or tending fields. On Sundays or trips into town, they often switched to something finer. So when the Chloe story talks about a woman wearing a green turban, that detail isn't unusual at all. It fits perfectly within the real history and culture of the time. What was meant in a legend as a mark of punishment would, in truth, have been an ordinary and deeply rooted part of African and Creole womanhood in Louisiana. In other words, the headscarf didn't make Chloe stand out, it made her belong to a community of strong, resilient women who wrapped their hair not just in cloth, but in dignity. Now, cutting off a person's ear wasn't a typical punishment for eavesdropping on a Louisiana plantation, not by a long shot. That kind of mutilation was rare, reserved for the harshest crimes in the eyes of the slave owners, like running away or rebellion. Back in the old days, when Louisiana was still more swamp than state, the Code Noir, that old French black code from 1724, gave masters wide leeway to punish enslaved people. The Caribbean version even said a runaway could lose an ear or be branded with the fleur-de-lis. And while that clause didn't officially make it into the Louisiana law, the spirit of it sure lingered. Later, under Spanish and then American rule, the codes kept the same dark promise. An enslaver could correct someone however he saw fit, whipping, branding, or worse. Most punishments stopped at the lash or the chain, but ever so often you'd see an old newspaper ad for a runaway described as missing an ear or branded on the cheek. These marks weren't for petty things like eavesdropping or talking back. They were meant to make examples of people who dared to reach for their freedom. So while ear cropping did happen, it wasn't common. And it wasn't for something small. It was a brutal warning, a way for the powerful to say, this is what happens when you forget your place. So if Sarah and her children weren't poisoned, what happened to them? It must be remembered that death came easy in the 1820s, like the fog rolling off the river at dawn, quiet, unannounced, and unstoppable once it settled in. Folks in St. Francisville didn't need to see headlines or hear church bells to know when yellow fever had returned. You could smell it in the sickness, feel it in the fear, and count it in the funerals. That's how it was for Sarah Matilda Bradford Woodruff, the young mistress of Laurel Hill Plantation. She didn't die from poison like the story says. She died the way so many did back then, from yellow fever, that ghastly plague that rose with the summer heat. It was likely somewhere in the early summer of 1824, maybe even 1823, when the mosquitoes were thick and the air itself seemed to hum with sickness. Her husband, Clark Woodruff, was left to watch as the fever came for their children next. Not all at once, but one by one, like a slow heartbreak. First was James, their son, who died on July 15, 1824, his young body no match for the burning fever that wrecked him. Then, just when they thought the worst had passed, Cornelia Gale, their bright, laughing girl, fell ill in September of that same year, dying on the 16th, 2 months after her brother. There wasn't a full-blown epidemic in St. Francisville that year. No mass graves, no bells tolling day and night, just scattered cases. Quiet tragedy spread across the plantations. Too few for the papers to notice, but enough to leave whole families broken. In towns like that, death didn't need to make noise to be felt, it just lingered on the breeze. When Elizabeth Bradford, Matilda's mom, died a few years later in 1831, Clark gathered up the one child he had left, Mary Octavia, and moved to Carrollton, across the Mississippi River, and far, far away from the memories and the pain. But he never really escaped them. The fever took his wife and 2 of his children in the space of a single summer, and the ghost of that loss clung to him like the scent of cypress and rain. So let me tell you about the mirror, the one folks swear still holds the souls of the dead. They say this grand old mirror, tall, gilt-framed, and dark as a cypress swamp at midnight, has hung in the house since the early 1800s. Its glass is rippled and clouded, the kind of old silvering that catches your reflection like it's thinking twice before giving it back. According to legend, when Sarah Matilda Woodruff and 2 of her children died suddenly, their souls were never properly set free. In those days, Southern custom said every mirror in the house had to be covered when someone died, so that a departing spirit wouldn't get trapped. But this one, as the story goes, for whatever reason, wasn't. When the mourning drapes came down, strange things started to happen. Visitors could see handprints appear on the inside of the glass, small ones, like a child. Some say they saw faces behind the reflection, pale, mournful, half hidden in the silver fog of age. One old housekeeper said she caught sight of a woman in old-fashioned dress staring back at her, weeping silently. But when she turned around, no one was there. Even today, that mirror hangs in the hallway like an open doorway between centuries. People lean close, trying to catch what others have seen. Sometimes they just see themselves. Sometimes they see something else. The Myrtles has plenty of ghost stories, but that mirror, that's the one that makes you pause before you check your hair. Now, down here in the deep south, in these grand old plantation homes, where the ceilings stretch high enough to hold the heat and the summers drag on like a lazy river, every lady had herself a little kingdom, a quiet retreat called the day room. Some folks called it the morning room, others the sitting room, but no matter what the name, it was hers. A place where she could set down the burdens of being mistress of the manor and just breathe. You'd find it tucked near her bedroom or down some shaded hallway where the breeze could drift through the tall windows dressed in lace. The light would pour in like honey, glinting off the writing desk where she kept her letters and her ledgers, everything neat as a hymn book. That's where she'd sit, smoothing accounts, writing to kinfolks and Natchez, or maybe working a bit on embroidery while the kettle hissed softly beside her. Now, don't mistake it for the grand parlor. Oh no, the parlor was for company, full of straight-back chairs and portraits that never blinked. The day room was different, soft, easy, familiar. You may hear the slow rhythm of a rocking chair, catch a whiff of camellias in a vase, or see the faint impression of someone who just rose from the fainting couch. It was the one room in the house where a woman could loosen her corsets, drop her voice, and remember she was human. But here's where the story takes a turn. In this very room, what they now call the French room for the antique furniture imported from Paris, folks say they see Chloe's spirit the most often. The legend says she was the nanny, but I've always wondered if maybe her duties ran closer to the heart of the house. See, in those antebellum days, there was often an enslaved woman called the lady's maid. She wasn't out in the fields or in the kitchen. Her world revolved around the mistress herself. She rose before dawn to heat bathwater, press dresses, and lay out jewelry, and she stayed on duty long after the candles burned low. She was there when the mistress dressed, when she wept, and when she prayed. It was a strange closeness, an intimacy wrapped in chains. She saw everything, heard everything, and carried it all in silence. And when the house finally slept, she laid her head down too, close enough to answer a call, but never close enough to belong. They say when night falls, footsteps can be heard crossing that floor. A creak, a sigh, the whisper of skirts brushing past. Maybe it's just old wood settling, or maybe it's something more. The echoes of those who once walked that house in life and duty. Either way, the Myrtle still holds its stories tight, like secrets pressed in between lace and linen. And if you stand in that lady's room long enough, with the lamps burning low and the air still as breath, you may just feel someone there beside you, watching, waiting, as she's done for over 200 years. Hey y'all, real quick, if you're enjoying this video and want to support our channel, consider becoming a Gulf Coastal Connections member. Members get exclusive extras and help us keep exploring the Gulf Coast and beyond. You'll get perks like our members-only podcast, custom emojis, and badges that show off your support. Just click the join button below this video to check it out. We really appreciate it, y'all. Now let me tell you about the dining room in one of these big antebellum plantation houses. It wasn't just a place to eat. Oh no, this room was a full-on stage show for wealth, manners, and family pride. Picture it, a long polished table of mahogany shining like river water at sunset, silver catching the candlelight, and portraits of stern ancestors staring down from the walls as if to say, mind your posture. The ceilings were high, the curtains heavy, and the air thick with the smell of roasted duck and beeswax polish. This is where the grown-ups ruled, the adult dining room. Children didn't get a seat at that table. This is where the fine art of conversation got its polish, where a raised eyebrow could wound deeper than a blade. A well-timed compliment could open doors for generations. Reputations rose and fell between spoonfuls of gumbo and sips of imported French wine. This was theater, plain and simple. The kind meant to remind every guest that this was no backwoods farm, but a house of standing. The dining room said everything about a family before a word was ever spoken. The china sparkled, the silver gleamed, and the conversation flowed smoother than the Madeira in the decanters. Now, if these old walls could talk, they'd whisper stories far heavier than ghost tales and candlelit doors. See, back during the Civil War, when cannon smoke rolled over the Mississippi and the air itself seemed to tremble, this house saw its share of sorrow. When Woodruff and Stirling passed in 1854, his widow, Mary Cobb Stirling, kept the plantation running as best she could. The war had turned the whole region upside down. Blue and gray soldiers moving like shadows through the cane fields, gunboats trading thunder across the river, and the roads, they were filled with wounded and weary men. Then came the siege of Port Hudson, just downriver, a brutal, choking standoff that dragged from May clear through July of 1863. It was the longest siege in American history. The Union wanted that stretch of the Mississippi, and the Confederates, half-starved and outnumbered, dug in and refused to surrender. The fighting was so fierce and the heat was so thick that the land itself seemed to bleed. By the time Port Hudson fell, thousands were dead, and the rest, those still breathing, were broken, shot, or dying slow from infection. That's when places like the Myrtles turned from grand homes into field hospitals. During and after the siege, this house became a refuge for the wounded, a quiet, shaded mercy in a world gone mad. The wide galleries let the breeze flow through, and the tall doors opened onto cool, dark rooms where soldiers lay in rows, whispering prayers or calling for their mothers. They say Mary Stirling opened her doors without hesitation, doing what she could with what little she had. This very room, yes, the one I'm standing in right now, was just one of the many that held the broken and the dying. You can almost picture it, the smell of whiskey and blood, the flies thick on the bandages, and the moans that carried through the night. Some of those poor boys, they refused amputation, terrified of the saw and the pain. Many never had the choice. Gangrene took them before the surgeon could. The stories tell of blood-stained floors, stains so deep they soaked through the boards themselves. And when the war ended and peace returned to the South in name only, these marks never fully faded, nor did the memory. So when folks say the Myrtles is haunted, maybe they're right. Maybe it's not just one restless spirit or another old legend. Maybe it's the echo of all those lives that passed through here in those hot, terrible months of 1863. The men who came to this house seeking healing and instead found their final rest. The ladies' parlor was the crown jewel of any big southern plantation house. You could tell everything you needed to know about a family the second you stepped foot in this room. The furniture shined like it was afraid not to. The air smelled of rosewater and polished wood. And every portrait on the wall looked like it was keeping score of who'd been invited and who hadn't. This was her territory, the lady of the house. The men might have run the fields and the ledgers, but the parlor, that was her kingdom. Afternoon light would spill through those curtains, catching the edge of a silver tray where the calling cards sat, and she'd glide in like a queen holding court. Neighbors would drop by for a short visit, which always meant about an hour of talk, about who'd married, who died, and who'd showed up to church wearing something scandalous. The lady would pour the tea from a pot so fine you could see the steam curling through the porcelain, and she'd pass around little cakes or sugared fruit while keeping her smile sweet and her opinion sharper than scissors. Come evening, someone might sit at the piano, usually a daughter showing off her lessons, and fill that room with soft music and softer glances. If a young man came calling, the parlor became a stage for courtship, eyes meeting over the teacups where Mama kept watch. But don't let the lace and laughter fool you. That grace came at a price. While guests admired the shine of the mahogany and the glow of the candles, unseen hands were always moving, dusting, polishing, lighting, serving. The servants who kept that parlor perfect rarely crossed its threshold except to make sure it stayed that way. So when you picture the ladies' parlor, the scent of flowers, the whisper of silk skirts, the hum of a hymn played just slow enough to make you sigh. Remember, it wasn't just a room, it was a performance, a delicate dance of gentility and power, played out every day under the watchful eyes of portraits, gossips, and ghosts alike. They called her Fanny Williams, mistress of the Myrtles in the early 1900s, wife to Harrison Milton Williams, and matriarch of a home that had already seen a war, a flood of sorrows, and more whispers than any one porch can hold. She kept the place going into the Depression years, and when she passed in 1935, the keys and the memories slid on to her people. Ask around St. Francisville, and the house lore paints her as proper, steady, and unflappable, the kind of lady who could pour tea with one hand and settle a household squabble with the other. Folks today still sleep beneath her roof in the upstairs Fanny Williams room. Some call it the doll room, and say the air up there keeps its own counsel after midnight. Now about seances. Were they ever held at the Myrtles in Fanny's day? I couldn't find a clean paper trail, yes. No diary entry, no society page notice that said Spirit Summit at 9, bring a calling card. What we do know is that Louisiana was knee-deep in spiritualism from the late 1800s through the 1930s. New Orleans even printed a French-language spiritualist paper, proof that table tipping and spirit circles weren't just a parlor fad. They were a whole conversation with the dead. And by the 1920s and 30s, black spiritual churches were braiding that spirit talk with prayer, healing, and hymn, keeping that flame alive while mainstream spiritualism dimmed. So if seances came to the Myrtles, they would have felt right at home with the times. Picture it the way the South does. Lamps turned low, chairs pulled in a tight ring, fingers resting light as moth wings on a tabletop waiting to tremble. A medium voice softens, somebody's auntie stifles a sob, and for a heartbeat, the past leans forward like it means to speak. That's how it was done from the early 1900s into the mid-1930s, in parlors, back rooms, church halls, sometimes whispered, sometimes advertised, always half believed. The historians will give you the scaffolding, the stories will hang the curtains. So here's the honest ledger on Fanny. The records tie her to the Myrtles and to 1935. The upstairs room still carries her name. The rest, the seances, the midnight knockings, the things seen out of the corner of an eye, belong to tradition. And around here, tradition has got a long memory and a louder voice than most printed pages. Alright, picture this. A southern gentleman's parlor sometime around the year of 1874. The air is heavy with magnolia and pipe smoke. The heat thick even with every window open. The heart of the house, it wasn't built for women's chatter or children's play. No, this was a man's domain, where time slowed to a draw and conversations carried more weight than the whiskey poured to grease it. The parlor with high ceilings, tall windows, dressed in damask, a marble mantel with a gilt-framed mirror hanging proud above it. The furniture was solid mahogany, carved and polished to shine. You could see your face in it. Set around a center table, strewn with ledgers and newspapers. A decanter of brandy or bourbon set ready on a sideboard. crystal catching the glow of the fire or lamplight. The faint tick of a brass clock kept the rhythm of the room, though no one was in much of a hurry. This was where deals were struck: cotton, sugar, land, and politics. Over cigars rolled dark as the river mud. It was where neighbors argued about the governor and bragged about the weather, where letters from New Orleans or Memphis might be read aloud, and where, after supper, the host retreated to escape the clatter of silver and the hum of women's talk in the dining room. You can almost hear the floorboards creak under boots polished for Sunday. The air carries the scent of tobacco, oak, and pride, the ghost of ambition and ruin alike. For in that gentleman's parlor, beneath portraits and plantation maps, the South dreamed its grandest dreams and met its quiet reckoning, one brandy glass at a time. Now, every house with a ghost has a reason, and the Myrtles Plantation has one carved in blood and memory: the murderer William Drew Winter, whose footsteps folks still swear they hear climbing the staircase on cold, still nights. They say if you stand at the bottom of that grand old stair after midnight, the air turns heavy as damp wool. Then you hear it, one step, then another, slow and pained, like a dying man dragging himself upward. 17 steps, always 17, and then silence. That's where William fell, or so the story goes. But before he became a ghost, William Winter was a man with more enemies than friends in a world not ready for the ideas he carried. William Drew Winter wasn't born to the South. He came from Bath, Maine, born in 1820, educated in law, and made his way down the Mississippi looking for opportunity. He married Sarah Stirling, daughter of Rough and Gray Stirling, and took up residence at the Myrtles, running the family estate and practicing law. He owned enslaved people before the war, as many men in that time did, but that may not be where his true sentiments lay. By the late 1860s, Winter had aligned himself with the Republican cause, openly supporting Reconstruction and civil rights for free people, a stance that made him mighty unpopular amongst his neighbors in West Feliciana Parish, where tempers were still raw, and the past refused to die. To his neighbors, he was that Yankee lawyer, a man from away, meddling in Southern business. To freedmen, he was one of the few white men who'd argue their case in court. And in the politics of 1870 Louisiana, that was a dangerous way to live. The facts as they were printed still tell a chilling tale. According to local newspapers, on the evening of January 26, 1871, our horseman rode up to the gates of the Myrtles and called for Mr. Winter. The lawyer stepped out onto the front gallery to meet his visitor. A single gunshot cracked through the night. The bullet hit Winter square in the chest. The local reporter wrote, Mr. W.D. Winter, a lawyer of this parish, was shot dead last evening at his residence by an unknown party. The assassin escaped. It is believed the act was a result of a personal or political quarrel. Other reports in the New Orleans Republican, the statewide Republican paper, painted the killing as a work of political vengeance. Winter, they said, had angered powerful men through his Reconstruction dealings, siding with freemen in land disputes and representing northern investors unwelcome in the old Louisiana circles. Still, others whispered it was nothing so grand, just a business matter gone bad, a debt unpaid, or a client betrayed. Some even named a suspect, E.S. Weber, a man said to have clashed with Winter over money. But Weber vanished before any trial, and the law, thin and wary as it was in those days, let the case die. William Winter was buried the next day at Grace Episcopal Church Cemetery in St. Francisville. His widow, Sarah, lived only 7 more years, dying in 1878, leaving behind 6 children and a legend that would outlive them all. The heartbeat of a southern plantation house after supper? Now, that was what was called at the time the gentleman's retreat. Cigar smoke in the air, bourbon on the table, and the sound of men finally letting their voice stretch out after a day of polite company. You could call it the card room or the game room, but to them it was holy ground, a place to loosen a collar, cuss their luck, and tell the truth for once. Dark cypress walls, lamplight gleaming on polished wood, thick curtains holding back the night, a slow fan turning overhead while cigars burned low and cards hit the table. There was always a decanter of bourbon within reach, crystal catching firelight like honey. The air smelled of pipe smoke, bay rum, and pine, the perfume of old Southern men. While the ladies drifted off to the music room, the men gathered here, planters, judges, and cotton men, to play whist or poker and talk railroads, crops, and politics. Some laughed, some argued, a few got loud enough to wake the hounds. Fortunes rose and fell on that green felt, and sometimes a man's reputation went with his chips. When the lamps burned low and the last bourbon poured, someone would say, "Gentlemen, that'll do." They'd rise, straighten their coats, and leave the ghost of laughter behind them. That room wasn't just part of the house, it was the South itself, smoky, secretive, and full of stories that never made it past the door. Now there's a name folks still whisper soft as the Spanish moss at dusk. Little Kate Winter, born at the Myrtles Plantation in the years when the war was done, but sorrow still lingered like a shadow on the land. Her story's sharp, but it clings to that house like perfume and prayer, part memory, part legend, part heartache. Kate came along around 1867, the youngest child of William Drew Winter and his beautiful wife Sarah. She was one of those lucky children everyone dotes on. But Louisiana in those years were full of unseen dangers, bad water, biting insects, and fevers that came on the wind. In the summer of 1870, typhoid fever swept through West Feliciana Parish, and the Myrtles was not spared. Typhoid was a quiet killer then, born from a cup of tainted water or a pot of stew gone bad. It started with a headache and a weariness that felt like the bones giving up. Then came the belly pains, the heat, and the delirium. Families prayed, doctors bled, mothers cooled foreheads with damp cloths, but medicine had little to offer. Many slipped away by the second or third week, their fever burning out only when they did. Kate was just 3 years old when the sickness took her. The family buried her in the shaded yard of Grace Episcopal Church Cemetery in St. Francisville, the same ground that would later hold her father, who was killed not long after. Her small stone still stands there, worn smooth by time, carved with only her name and her age, Kate Lyle Winter, age 3. They say her spirit never left. Some claim to see a little girl in white wandering the galleries, or playing near the cabins at night, her laughter faint as the wind through the cane. Whether ghost or memory, she remains part of this place, a reminder of how fragile life was in the Old South, and how love, once given, never really dies. What makes the green turban ghost photo so remarkable is how legitimate it appears. In 1992, Frances Meyer, owner of the Myrtles Plantation, was taking ordinary daylight pictures of her property for insurance purposes. No ghost hunts, no tricks. When the film was developed, one image stopped her cold. A faint, life-size figure of a woman in a long skirt and green head wrap, standing between two buildings where no one had been. Frances sent the photo for professional analysis. Experts examined the original negative. They found no signs of tampering, double exposure, or manipulation. Decades later, no one has been able to recreate the effect. The photo remains undeclared but undeciphered, one of the clearest unexplained images ever taken. It still hangs at the Myrtles, a certified enigma of film and folklore that even skeptics admit has never been debunked. Well now, I'll tell you straight. I went to the Myrtles Plantation one night for their evening mystery tour, and if that house ain't haunted, then it's sure working hard to fake it. You step onto that wide front gallery, and the air just changes. Heavy, perfumed with old wood and Spanish moss, like the whole house is holding its breath. The guides are top notch, friendly, funny, and not the type to be sneaking around knocking on walls or faking ghost noises. They don't need to. That house does all the talking for itself. We heard loud knocks coming from the second floor. I mean, loud enough to make everybody in the group freeze and look up like we were caught in church gossip. Nobody up there, no tricks, just that old house reminding us who's boss. Now, they tell the legends on that tour. Sure they do. And that's half the fun. Down here, storytelling is how we keep history alive. We don't separate fact from myth too clearly. We like it all stirred together like a good gumbo. A good ghost story gets folks listening, and once you got their attention, that's when you slip in the real history. The families, the heartbreak, the beauty, and the tragedy. It's how people remember. The daytime tours are for history buffs and architecture lovers, and they are fascinating, informative, and I highly recommend them. But the nighttime ones are for folks like me who don't mind a little chill up their spine. And look, myth doesn't mean made up. Myths grow out of something true, a feeling, a death, a memory too strong to stay quiet. Maybe there's no Chloe, but there's something in that house that hums after dark. Thousands of people visit every year, and plenty leave with their own stories to tell. I'm one of them. The place is beautiful. The staff's as kind as a church supper hostess. And even if you don't believe in ghosts, the Myrtles will make you wonder. So, go see for yourself. History by day, mystery by night, and if the dead ain't walking those halls, it sure feels like they are. If you've been enjoying this video and want to help us keep exploring the Gulf Coast, consider joining Gulf Coastal Connections as a channel member. You get exclusive perks like our members-only podcast, custom emojis, and badges that show your support for this community. Just hit that join button below to check it out. It really helps us keep the stories rolling. And while you're at it, don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. It's free, it only takes a second, and it makes a world of difference. Hitting that little red button and the bell beside it means you'll never miss our latest adventures, ghost stories, and our Gulf Coastal history deep dives. And of course, smash that little button if you've had a good time. It helps more folks find these videos and keeps our little Gulf Coastal family growing. Most of all, drop a comment and join the conversation. Always meant this to be a two-way street, because if it's just me talking, well, that's not a conversation, that's a monologue. So tell me what you think, share your stories, and let's keep this thing going together. And from the bottom of my heart, thank you for your support.